Welcome to Dialogue, the podcast where I, your host, Rebecca Sebastian, sit down with the leading voices in crime, culture, and justice. We discuss true crime, the whole genre, everything inside it, around it, criminal justice, you name it. That's what we do. I'm so thrilled that you're here. And before we get to today's guest, just a couple of quick updates / announcements. CrimeCon is next week. I cannot believe it. It's already here and it's in Las Vegas and I will be there on Podcast Row. I will also be hosting trivia at one of the VIP evening events. And I will be interviewing some of the presenters for the virtual at-home audience. So if you're coming to Las Vegas for CrimeCon, please make sure to come say hi at my table on Podcast Row. I would love to meet you. I also got some very cool swag exclusive for the event. You will not find this anywhere else. It is Vegas themed. That can mean a lot of things. I'll let you guess. And if you're attending virtually, look for me in some of the presenter Q&A interviews after their presentations on the main stage. I am just very excited to see everyone, my friends, my podcast buddies and cohorts, and I just can't believe it's already CrimeCon time. So I hope to see you guys there. And next on the agenda is an ask, which never feels natural or normal, but neither do I feel natural or normal some of the time. So I need more reviews on Dialogue. My listener numbers are growing. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Share this podcast with your friends. But the reviews are kind of plateauing, and it's better when those are sort of in alignment for growth, for social proof, for discoverability, for all these things. It looks better when there's more reviews. So if you like Dialogue, or better yet, if you love Dialogue, if you like the guests that I talk to, if you like me for some reason, could you go leave a 5-star rating and a written review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify? It would mean a lot to me. I don't know how to ask other than just to say, I need you to do this. I would be grateful if you did it. And thank you in advance. And keep listening because I'm going to mention a way that you just might be rewarded for your effort. Now, let's get to the good stuff. We have been in a true crime book series. This is week 3, and it's been so exciting because the authors I've interviewed have written like the buzziest books in true crime. Everywhere I look, I see these books, the books of authors I've interviewed. So I feel like a little proud of myself for having my finger on the pulse in the way that I have. I'm not going to lie. And they're all just terrific people that I've been thrilled to get to know via the interviews. And their books are they're really good. Like, they're not always really good, true crime books. These are really high quality reads that I am proud to recommend, and I would recommend to just people who like great books and aren't necessarily, a true crime enthusiast. And my guest today and her book are no exception. I sat down with the lovely Jamie Gehring, who you might recognize from the Netflix documentary Unabomber in his own words. Now, you might be wondering, why was my guest in a documentary about Ted Kaczynski? Well, because he was her next door neighbor, and that is just what she's written about in her new book, Madman in the Woods. Now, if you would like to win a copy of this book, which literally came out yesterday, so you will be one of the first people to hold it in your hands, hustle on over to Apple or Spotify. And remember I said I need reviews? If you leave a review and you screenshot it and post it on Twitter or Instagram and tag me at DialoguePod, you will be entered to win a copy of this incredible book. Okay, and first of all, apologies to the whole world, but this is for the United States only. So pause right now or listen to the interview and then go leave a review, grab a screenshot of it, and then post on Twitter or post on Instagram at DialoguePod, and I will make note of that, and one of you will win this incredible book. And now for the great conversation I had with the deeply empathetic and super talented Jamie Gehring. Jamie, thank you for killing the small talk. Jamie, I am very excited to welcome you to Dialogue Podcast. It feels like this has been a long time in the making, so welcome.
I'm very excited to be here, and it really has. I feel like you and I have been chatting for, like 3 years.
Yeah, throw a pandemic in there, and it's like, what does time even mean? But it's true. This story and this book, which is now just about out in the world, is it official?
Just about out in the world. It is official on Tuesday the 19th, and it drops on hardcover, so anywhere people buy their books, but also on Audible, which is really exciting.
Oh, that's really exciting. And before we go any further, it's Madman in the Woods, Life Next Door to the Unabombers. So there's no burying the lead here. This is Jamie Gehring, and she grew up sharing property with Ted Kaczynski. We're going to get into it. So this is great because right now, if you're listening, that means the book is already out. So don't delay. You're going to want to read it, especially after you hear us chat. But on Audible, did you narrate or who narrated?
I did narrate it. And it was such an interesting experience because obviously I wrote the book and I expressed interest in narrating after Audible won the audio rights at an auction to my book. And they're like, yeah, sure, but you have to audition for it.
That's wild.
I know. So I got the part.
Well, yeah. How did you prepare to voice the voice of your voice? Like, please tell me. I'm so curious about this, and congratulations.
Thank you so much. I have 3 children and I have been reading out loud for 16 years, I think. And so honestly, I think that was a great preparation in order to narrate my own book. And, the night before I would read a bit, especially if it was a more difficult or emotional part of the book. But actually that emotion was really, I think, powerful in it. There's still parts of it that when I talk about, when I'm reading it, it makes me cry. Yeah. And I just kind of went with it and kind of pushed through that. So anyway, it was quite the experience. I'm so glad that I got the opportunity to do it.
I really am too. And I love when authors narrate their own books. There's never really been a time where I've listened to an Audible and been like, I wish it hadn't been them, like ever. And there's some amazing voiceover artists who do a beautiful job narrating. But when it's a memoir and just a personal story, like I want to hear that person's voice, and you have a lovely voice. So, so great. Get it on Audible too. That's a great option for people. So I'm so curious. Obviously, it's a story worth telling. They say one of the best stories is an ordinary person in an extraordinary circumstance. And that would apply to you, to your dad. But I'm curious what the moment was when you decided, I have to tell this story. I have to put pen to paper and begin this journey. What was going on with your life at that moment that you decided, now I'm ready to share this?
So I think it was multiple events. So when Ted Kaczynski was arrested, I was only 16 and I didn't fully understand the impact of that event or how it would affect me through the years at that time. And then I've always wanted to write the book, but my father passed away and I really felt the need then to tell the story and his part in the investigation. And then shortly after that, my younger sister passed away. And I knew at that point that I had to write the story. I had to finally tell this. And then at that time as well, I started outlining and I started reading books about writing and going to writing classes and really starting to remember, my interactions with Ted and our family's interactions with Ted, and writing those down. And then that's when the production company that filmed Unabomber in his own words contacted me. And each time we would have a pre-tape conversation, he would be like, you have to finish this book. These stories are incredible and you have to tell the story. So it was, really a combination of multiple things in my life that pushed me to kind of really put myself out there and share this finally.
And so interesting that you were prepping to tell the story and then called upon to speak into the story in another medium with a whole other entity. It feels like a sign, it was kind of like a confluence of events. So let's go back in time a little bit. You call him Ted. It's just so wild to read your book because he's referred to as Ted and Teddy. He was a known neighbor, and the environment you grew up in is unique. Most people don't grow up. I don't know how many people are in Montana. I've never been. I want to go so badly. But you're in this tiny little town an hour outside of the capital. Most people are familiar with the story of Ted Kaczynski, maybe why he sought out this ultra rural cabin of isolation. But why did your parents seek that out? And what was it like growing up? I know it really shaped you as a person and a writer. Can you talk about your family's beginnings there?
Yeah, so my family originally came to Montana in the 1860s, so a very long time ago. And my grandfather ended up purchasing about 9,000 acres in Lincoln, Montana, right outside of the town, in 1948. So fourth generation ranchers in our family, cattle ranchers, still run a ranching operation. And that really just kind of began, I suppose, the love for that type of lifestyle and that rural environment. And the town of Lincoln, like you said, is tiny. It's, close to 1,000 residents. There's literally one stoplight in the entire town, and it's blinking. It's not even like a red and green signal. I mean, it is very close-knit, very tiny. So yeah, that's what brought us there, and definitely shaped me and my love for nature and that kind of environment, and of course inspired my writing as well.
So can you talk about the layout and the landscape where Ted Kaczynski was in proximity to your family's property?
Yeah. So in 1971, my grandfather decided to sell a parcel of land kind of on the southern fringes of his ranch. So of that 9,000 acres, he took 1.4 acre off and decided to sell it. And our property still surrounded this parcel of land. And of course, that is what Ted and David Kaczynski had purchased. So for all of those years, from 1971, when they purchased the property, until 1996, our property had surrounded Kaczynski's.
Talk about the progress and the evolution of Kaczynski when you were clued into who he might be. And probably it was your dad before you. Talk a little about that journey.
So that is so interesting. And it was such a really important part of writing this story because, of course, I had my own memories of Ted, or Teddy, as I referenced him as a kid. But then in talking to my own mother, and then my stepmother and neighbors and such, and hearing about what their own memories were as well, and just kind of matching those up during the timeline was so interesting because in the late 70s, Ted appeared much more like that Berkeley professor than the man that was arrested in 1996, pulled from his cabin with the disheveled look. And so through those years, his appearance definitely transformed, and he seemed to kind of transform on the exterior as a person. In the early 80s, he was coming to our home for dinner. He had held me as a baby. Of course, I don't remember that, but my mom was able to share that with me. And he seemed to really want to spend time with our little family in those years. And whether, he was truly, maybe he was lonely, or it could have been that he was, just creating this cover of being this seemingly a normal neighbor. We'll probably never know. But either way, during those early years in the 80s, he was spending quite a bit of time with us. And then as the years ticked on, the visits were much more sporadic. His behavior seemed to change. He was seemingly much more task-driven when he would come by. He was kind of almost like frenzied. His appearance, his hair was just all over the place, nothing like the picture you see on the cover of Madman in the Woods.
Right.
He had stood on his face and dirt under his fingernails, and was very clear that he was not trying to fool anyone as far as, yes, he's the eccentric hermit next door. Right. He wasn't very close to that Berkeley professor that we originally first met.
Yes. And when you recall some of these childhood memories, I'm reading them, and you had and children, I think sometimes children do have an instinct around a bad person per se, or a dangerous person, but it didn't seem as though you did. You seemed quite calm and comfortable around him. He was generous. He would bring you these little gifts, like these hand-painted rocks. At what point in your awareness do you remember learning he was not a good guy? And like, how does that distort your memory and affect your memories of what you lived?
So it's very strange, honestly. I mean, in those early 80s, it was 1984 when I really have the first memory. So I was 4 years old with Ted. And I remember him very vividly bringing me painted rocks as a gift and feeling, very appreciative of it and excited to see him. I wasn't scared. But the first time I really had kind of an instinct face to face with him was in the early 90s when he would come by the home and my parents weren't there, and I would hide in the closet while he was knocking because I had fear. There was something there that I knew I didn't want to open that door, and I didn't want to let him in or talk to him. And so that's the first actual fear I remember facing him. But now looking back, when I was, I think it was the summer before kindergarten, I started hearing noises outside of my bedroom window, and it terrified me. I would run into my parents' room and tell them somebody was out there, and they were, they'd be like, it's just your overactive imagination, go back to bed. And, let me crawl into bed with them at least. And now putting that together and knowing that Ted Kaczynski was actually outside of my bedroom window, scavenging through pieces of equipment and gathering pieces for bomb making, was one, very terrifying, but also validating. Like I had those feelings as a little kid that I didn't quite recognize, but now as an adult looking back, I knew something was amiss.
And you wouldn't have had language for it then or made the association. So when did your father and when did your parents clue into who he might be? And how old were you?
So there were altercations between Ted Kaczynski and my father specifically through the years, especially early 90s. My dad was a sawyer. He had a sawmill, although it was a very tiny little sawmill. And clearly Ted Kaczynski was opposed to industry, especially that type of industry. And so, there were little things that happened through the years. There were arguments between him and my father. My father's sawmill was sabotaged. But my dad he did have these fleeting moments where he suspected Ted because he didn't quite trust him. Mm-hmm. But it would come back to like, oh, what harm could he possibly do? He's this hermit living off grid in this tiny 10 by 12 cabin in the woods, 4 miles from town, no running water, no electricity. He doesn't work. Like how would he have funding to do anything? It's just the eccentric neighbor. It's just strange Ted. And so it would always kind of come back to that. He would rationalize with himself. But then right before Kaczynski's arrest, the FBI arrived and was speaking to my father. And of course, at first, they didn't just come out and say, hey, we're looking into the fact that your neighbor could be the Unabomber. They had to kind of feel each other out first and make sure, because they didn't know if Ted Kaczynski was truly working with anyone else.
Sure.
He would reference in many of his writings that it was a group of terrorists. And so, they thought most likely it was just him, but they didn't know if my dad could have been involved or any other neighbors. So after they kind of, had some rapport, the FBI and my father, and the FBI decided, specifically Max Knoll, the arresting officer, decided that he could trust my dad. He told him that first they said they were investigating him based on some suspicious letters he was writing. Okay. And then it came out, he finally did tell him that they actually suspect Ted of being the Unabomber. And my dad was completely shocked. I mean, initially he was like, there's no way. There's just, again, he's living out in this tiny little place with nothing. There's no way he could elude the FBI for 17 years. And then things started to make sense. The sabotage of his mill, strange encounters, it all kind of came together in his mind. And from that point on, there was a small amount, I think, that my dad hoped that it wasn't Ted Kaczynski.
Yeah.
But he came around to the idea that it could be, and he offered his help on the investigation.
Imagine, if you dare.
Whoa, hold tight.
A podcast so shocking.
No, it's not that shocking. It's just
so disturbing.
Now you're just being dramatic.
That it will chill you to your very core.
Have you even heard the show?
There's no escaping.
I mean, there is.
The horrible consequences of.
Just press pause, but don't do that.
Fright Day.
Hi, my name is Byron McCoy, and each week I join my friends Sam and Kelly, where we talk films, monsters, the paranormal, and pretty much all things frightening. From time to time, we talk with like-minded specialists, directors, actors, cryptozoologists, conspiracy theorists, but whether it's the human terror of serial killers and home invasions, or the extra-normal phenomena Kelly covers in her Cryptids and Conspiracies segment, if it bleeds, hacks, stabs, chops, summons, sacrifices, abducts, or bites, it is Fright Day. Every week on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or at frightday.com.
Frightday.com.
Stop it. You're scaring them.
Sorry.
Which is incredible. I mean, so brave. What a hero. But of course you wouldn't believe it at first. I would imagine your mind put something to protect you that's like, I cannot compute, cannot get my head around that, because of course he's going to be flashing back to all the memories of you in proximity to him and all the what ifs and could haves and should haves and what will happen now. Are we all imminently at risk? So is there a family meeting? Is there a, hey kids, we have something to tell you? You're a teenager now, right? What happens?
So I'm a teenager, and I actually I'd been living with my dad that year prior to Kaczynski's arrest. But at the beginning of that school year, I went back to California to live with my mom. So I actually was not there when the FBI arrived.
It's probably good.
That's probably good. That being said, they were so clear with my dad that he could not share this information with anyone.
Okay.
That included his own wife.
Oh my gosh.
So I know. And even when my father went to go, he volunteered after being asked, of course, to videotape Ted Kaczynski's cabin and their surrounding property in preparation of the arrest. And my dad couldn't even tell his own wife that that's what he was doing. It wasn't until basically right before the arrest that my stepmother even knew that Ted Kaczynski could be the Unabomber and that this was going on. So, and my dad was even after the arrest, he was so guarded about the story. He took it so seriously, probably for good reason.
Absolutely. But this is exactly, I think, why I'll never, sadly, partner with the FBI, because I could never sit on that information. I just don't think I'm not saying I would put it on the podcast, but I think I'd have to clue my spouse in it. It's really remarkable that he did that, so were they protecting him in some way when he's literally setting up surveillance or recordings of Kaczynski's cabin? I mean, that's scary and dangerous.
It is scary. And my dad was former military. Okay. I think that he obviously felt comfortable doing that, but he was also, he confided in me after the arrest that he was terrified on that day that he was walking up towards Kaczynski's home with a video camera. Remember, this is way before our iPhone and
right.
like a GoPro. We had nothing like that. It was the old school family video camera that you use when you're taping Christmas morning. It was
that gets heavy on your shoulder or your arm if you're recording for any period of time. Yeah, this is clunky stuff.
Yeah, so he's holding that by his hip as he walks the road, and he did walk the property often. Again, our family's land surrounded Kaczynski's, so he wasn't out of place, but he would have been out of place if they ran into each other and he had a video camera in his hand.
Yeah.
So, yes, he was scared, but he knew that there was no other choice at that point, because anyone else, Ted would have been tipped off. I mean, he had a lookout tree behind the cabin. He was definitely watching.
It was really like your dad or no one. I mean, and it sounds like your dad took that to heart and was willing to step up in this remarkable way. Looking back, it would seem that he would have been committing crimes because he committed crimes during this whole period of time that he wasn't caught when he was interacting with you as a small child. I'm sure in this process of looking back and just being able to connect dots now that you didn't know then, that you knew that he had harmed people had died because of violent acts that he did when he was in this interacting with you as a child. It's just a lot for the brain to process. And a lot of your book is this reconciliation of Ted as the man you knew and then Ted as the Unabomber you come to discover. So I want people to read the book, obviously, and go with you on that journey. But sitting here now, what is it like to reconcile a human being? Because that's something we talk about on Dialogue a lot, is that we all aren't one thing or the other. Even the worst people who do the worst things usually aren't all of that. And there's all these factors that inform it. So what was the journey of trying to begin to piece this together for your own process? And where do you sit now?
It was a windy road, and it was pretty harrowing, honestly. I mean, even the things that I thought I knew about Ted, there was so much more, and things that I had unearthed that were truly terrifying. And I didn't know about him until I was writing the book. So that was a really difficult part of it. But I think even being touched by true crime myself in my own life, I still went into this with the idea that a monster is recognizable, I suppose. Like that's what we're looking for in a killer, is these obvious signs that they're a murderer or they're capable of being a serial killer or a domestic terrorist. And I think that was a really difficult part of this for me, is remembering that they're just human beings, and they, there's so many things that you can connect with, you can recognize in this killer. And that's terrifying in many ways.
I think it's more terrifying than the alternative of being able to look at someone and go, they're a monster. We can see that. It's obvious. We know him to be this. How much more scary to relate in some way to someone capable of that? Because then you have to call into question your own, what any of us are capable of at any time, and what prevented you from becoming like that versus him, right? Now, his upbringing was different than yours, but here you are when you're geographically in the same place, informed by the same environment, and yet these two different outcomes. So that makes perfect sense to me. Can you share one of the most alarming or disturbing things that you hadn't known previously until you dug into the research about Ted?
So in the process of writing Madman in the Woods, I read so much of Ted's writings. I mean, thousands of pages of his innermost thoughts, his journals, his autobiography. And then, of course, I interviewed David Kaczynski, his brother. And I think that the most kind of surprising part of this to me was really Ted's own journey, I suppose, his own history. And, I knew about his separation from his mother at 9 months when he had hives and ended up in the hospital. But I never was able to really understand that in its entirety until I read journal entries from Wanda, his mother, and how Ted really changed from, this friendly, happy baby to just being, what she says, something like a lump emotionally when he got home. And, seeing those, her own words, and kind of what shaped what we see as a monster was really powerful. And again, pretty surprising to me. So there were many things like that throughout the process, but that one really stands out.
That stood out to me as well. And also because you tied it into a story in your own motherhood journey when one of your own children was sick as an infant or around the same age. And it's a very beautiful parallel of like the difference between what if you could go with your child through a potentially traumatic medical emergency and stay with them versus in that day and age, they really just like took the baby away from her and he underwent this kind of traumatic thing without his mom. And it does seem like it shifted something in his wiring. So even your ability to almost put yourself in those shoes, I thought was pretty remarkable to even have the humility or wherewithal to do that. I think the mom describes him also, she says something like he seemed institutional or there was something, was that
there
the
word?
word?
An institutional look in his eyes or something like that. I think
I was like,
she says,
oh, that was.
I know, as a baby, especially, I mean, I will say that particular chapter, and of course the chapter with the victim impact statements, I cry still when I read both of those, because really as a mother, it was just so heartbreaking to read Wanda's words. And then throughout Ted's life, to read the letters that she would write and pleading with him from, in that little cabin in Montana through written word saying, I think this all comes back to that hospital incident when you were a baby and just the guilt that she felt and how heavy that had to be for her. Yeah. Of course I felt bad for the baby Ted, but his mother, it broke my heart.
It is heartbreaking. And of course this comes up nature versus nurture all the time when we talk about serial killers, domestic terrorists. Like, is this the fault of an environment, the people, the guardians, or is this just who someone is innately? I have my thoughts. What are yours?
Well, in my personal opinion, I feel like it was a combination of all of those things. So yeah. I think there was an underlying mental illness. I think maybe something was triggered at that 9-month mark with Ted, and then his ability to form relationships and bonds after that, which impacted him greatly. And in addition to that, he was advanced in school and he never really was able to relate to his peers and he felt isolated. And so there was all these little things that happened to this person. And then you add in a potential underlying mental illness. You add in being completely isolated in rural Montana with, trapped in the echo chamber of your own mind. And I believe that's really what eventually created this person.
I'm right there with you. I rarely think it's one or the other. It's usually some combination, and things are very rarely black or white. Like, it'd be really nice if we could just say definitively this is what caused that. But I find it's usually far too complex, and it's that messy gray middle of a million different things all, connecting. So can you talk about Ted's role in writing the story? You did reach out to him. Did anything come of that?
Yeah. So in addition to always wanting to write this book and tell this story, I've always wanted to write to Ted. And I know that seems odd, but he was such a big part of my childhood. And I almost just wanted to be like, hey, you really shocked us. Like, what the hell? So,
we didn't see that coming.
Yeah. You really fooled us. So anyway, I've always wanted to write to him, and with writing this book, and then especially after I did the documentary, I decided I finally would. And he did write back to me. And, in my initial letter, it was 8 pages. Wow. And there was a lot of what I just said, like, we were all really shocked when you were arrested. And I had mentioned that my father had passed away. And I did offer a couple apologies. I mean, when I was a little kid, I had a little motorcycle that I would ride around. It was just a little Honda 90. It wasn't terribly noisy or anything, but sometimes I would ride around his property, on the logging roads, and I read in his journals how much that noise bothered him. Right or wrong, I felt like I can offer an apology for possibly disturbing him and his peace out there. And then I had some questions. I was still kind of looking for that little kernel of good in this story. And that maybe these years in prison, he had time to reflect or change, and who knows? So I was still looking for that little kernel of good. And his response was very much on the surface. You know, he said that he did appreciate hearing from me. It's something like he always appreciates hearing from people that he's known in the past, but he didn't have a lot of time to write because, you know, he's just, well, at that time he was still at Supermax, you know, literally alone all day long with nothing else to do, but he didn't have time.
I'm just guessing, this is a guess, that he doesn't get a lot of letters with apologies. I'm like, you must be the only human in history who has like anything to apologize to the Unabomber for. I think that is like the cutest thing I've ever heard. Interesting that you even opened up the potential for him to redeem himself or say something that would show some humanity. That says a lot about you, about what you're looking for and what you're open to. It's not a closed off binary way of writing someone off fully as a monster. I'm guessing, do you, or do you just, because some people I would imagine just compartmentalize and say, this is horrific. He's done evil things. He's a monster, and like good riddance. And I'm sure there's part of you that feels like that, but like, how is that not the overwhelming part, I guess?
Yeah, I think it's this crazy internal struggle, I guess, that I have definitely during the time that I was writing this. And I would find out that, you know, these horrible things that he had done just in our own backyard. I couldn't stop thinking of him as a monster. And as I was writing and researching the victim impact statements, it was definitely a time where I was just filled with this anger towards him. But he is a human being. And, you know, as much as I would love to just like compartmentalize him as a killer and a monster and just be able to write it off, it's so much more complicated than that. And especially knowing now, I mean, feeling like I never knew his mom, but feeling as though I connected with her through her writing and then through her other son, David. David still, I mean, he loves his brother so much, and he still hopes, I mean, him and I talk, and he still hopes that Ted will find healing in his heart while he's in prison. Wow. And so there's still, you know, there's still that hope that humanity is still present. For the most part, from what I've found during our interactions, that's not present.
Or it's so deeply buried. I mean, if it exists, it must just be under so many layers of self-protection and so many other things. Did you speak with any surviving members of family members of victims in your research?
I didn't. And I feel like if there weren't the victim impact statements, if there weren't the articles written about the victims and their families, that I would have. But I really felt like these people had been through enough and had been quite literally terrorized. I didn't want to inflict any sort of pain by reaching out to them. So I told their story in a way that the reader would be able to understand the depth and the impact of Ted Kaczynski's violence without having to have them relive that. And also I felt like it wasn't my own story to tell.
Yes.
And, you know, I wanted to share with readers the ripple effect, I suppose, of Ted Kaczynski's violence. But again, that wasn't the book that was my own story.
Right. And I think one of the ways I remember you phrasing that in the book is it's your memoir braided with Ted's story, which happens to be my favorite kind of true crime book, is a memoir that intertwines with a true crime story. I mean, I want to hear a person's firsthand point of view who was impacted by this. And you brought up that you are a person influenced by true crime and this genre. And that's something we talk a lot about on Dialogue. So how do you, like, forget reconciling Ted Kaczynski and whether he's a monster or not? Like, how do you reconcile even just your own interest in true crime outside of Ted Kaczynski and creating art that will live in that landscape? What are your thoughts on the genre and consuming it and creating inside of it?
So just being touched by true crime, living a true crime event definitely changed my own perception of the genre for sure. I think it really depends on how it's reported and how it's handled, and whether or not the victims are being respected and honored, I think is really important to the integrity of true crime. But I also feel like devouring true crime and trying to understand the mind of a murderer is somewhat empowering for people. And I personally, I felt that way while I was writing it. I feel like it can be beneficial for people to try to feel like they can understand something that is, much out of our control.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was just thinking. It's like a way to grasp onto something where it's so obvious we have no control. And for women, I hear this a lot on the show, this is a very women-dominated genre. I think there's a self-protection aspect and taking back power element, as you mentioned. I'm curious if what happened to you has informed your parenting. And how do you look at people, your neighbors, and, the figures, these, we all can think back on our child and be like, oh, is that guy weird? Neighbor. Yeah. I mean, you hear something about him, you're like, yep, he was. You have very good cause to not be trusting of people who get close to your kids. What does that look like as a mom?
So as a mother, I feel like, for one, the probably biggest takeaway from my own parenting is to teach my kids to trust their intuition, because obviously that's so important to them, but also listening to them as well when they have their own, particular intuition. So that's definitely shaped me. And then, I'm still, even though I went through this experience, I'm still very trusting. And, I trust people are inherently good until I have reason not to. And so I'm actually happy that I was able to hold on to that despite this experience. But I joke that, when I look at my neighbors now, what are the chances that I would live next to another serial killer? I think it's probably pretty slim.
Yeah, lightning doesn't strike twice, right? Right. You're good.
I should be careful what I say, but I mean...
I know, right? Let's not put that out there. The other thing I'm curious about is, before you started speaking publicly about your connection to Ted Kaczynski's story and life, so on this Netflix doc, now in your memoir, would you ever bring this up at a party if the Unabomber came up, or the news, or people, because that does come up. It's like a very big American moment. So would you be like, about that?
I was in corporate for years. I was an investment advisor and a private mortgage banker. And those mixers where they're like, tell us one crazy thing that we may not have ever heard and probably won't believe. And that would be my thing. I grew up next to the Unabomber and nobody would believe me.
Yeah. And everyone else is like, I have a tattoo of a frog on my back. And then everyone's like, whoa, mic drop, Jamie wins. That's incredible. I mean, that's kind of you should have some moments like that for you and your family having had to endure it.
To endure what we did. Absolutely.
I think that is totally fair. Well, Madman in the Woods is really beautiful. And I know that's a weird word to use when talking about a story that involves a lot of Ted Kaczynski, but it's true, and that's yours. And it's even more clear to me now that we spent this time together why that is a takeaway from the book. So I'm excited for people to read it and hear what they think about it. And I am really glad that we finally got to talk about it. And thank you for killing the small talk today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Dialogue is a Yellow Tape Media production, audio engineered by Jason Usry and produced, hosted and edited by me, Rebecca Sebastian. If you love the podcast, please consider becoming a diehard by signing up at patreon.com/dialogue. Other ways to support the show? Follow along on social media. We are at Dialogue Pod across platforms, and you can now watch most episodes on YouTube by subscribing to my channel, Rebecca Sebastian. For more information or to drop me a note, visit rebeccasebastian.com. Until next time, thank you for listening and killing the small talk.